The bullet missed her head by 3 inches, and Josephine Parker didn't even flinch as she continued loading the wagon with supplies outside the Fort Worth General Store on that scorching August morning in 1875. Zander Frost had been watching her from across the dusty street for the better part of an hour, his massive frame leaning against the hitching post outside the saloon. He had ridden into Fort Worth 2 days prior, coming down from the mountains of Colorado, where he had spent the last 3 years trapping and hunting, living a solitary existence that suited him just fine. His shoulder-length dark hair was tied back with a leather cord, and his muscular arms were crossed over his broad chest as he observed the commotion unfolding. When the shot rang out from somewhere down the street, likely a drunk cowboy celebrating too early in the day, every person in the vicinity had ducked or scrambled for cover. Every person except her. The woman simply paused for half a heartbeat, glanced in the direction of the gunfire with an expression that conveyed nothing but mild annoyance, then hoisted another sack of flour into the wagon bed with surprising strength for someone of her stature. Zander found himself straightening, his interest piqued in a way it hadn't been in years. She wore a simple brown dress that had seen better days, her auburn hair pulled back in a practical bun that was already coming loose in the Texas heat. Even from this distance, he could see the determined set of her jaw, the rigid line of her shoulders that spoke of someone carrying the weight of the world and refusing to let anyone see her buckle under it. He should have minded his own business. That had been his philosophy for 3 years now, ever since he had left civilization behind after losing his brother to a senseless bar fight in Denver. The mountains had been his refuge, the silence his companion, and he had convinced himself he preferred it that way. But something about the way this woman moved, the stubborn tilt of her chin, the way she seemed to be fighting an invisible battle with every breath, made him push away from the post and cross the street toward her. Josephine sensed him approaching before she saw him. She had developed a sixth sense about such things over the past 2 years, ever since her husband Thomas had died in a cattle stampede, leaving her with a failing ranch, debts that seemed to multiply like rabbits, and a reputation in Fort Worth as the stubborn widow who refused to accept reality. She turned, ready to deliver the sharp dismissal she had perfected, and found herself looking up at a mountain of a man who stood well over 6 feet tall. His eyes were the color of a winter sky, pale blue and piercing, set in a face that was all hard angles and sun-weathered skin. His broad shoulders strained against his buckskin shirt, and she could see the muscles in his forearms flex as he removed his worn hat. "Madam," he said, his voice a deep rumble that seemed to vibrate through her. "Looks like you could use a hand with those supplies." "Looks can be deceiving," Josephine replied, turning back to her wagon. "I manage just fine." Zander had expected as much. He stood there for a moment, watching as she struggled to lift a heavy barrel of molasses. Her arms trembled with the effort, but she refused to put it down, refused to show weakness. He saw the exact moment when her grip started to slip, saw her try to compensate, and without asking permission, he simply reached out and steadied the barrel with one hand, then lifted it as if it weighed nothing more than a sack of feathers. "I said I managed just fine," Josephine said through gritted teeth, though she didn't try to stop him as he placed the barrel securely in the wagon. "Didn't say you didn't," Zander replied evenly, "but there's managing and there's making things harder than they need to be." She turned to face him fully then, her green eyes flashing with something that looked like anger but he recognized as pride wounded so many times it had turned defensive. "I don't recall asking for your opinion or your help, Mr. Frost. Zander Frost." He met her gaze steadily, not backing down but not challenging her either. "And you're right, you didn't ask. but I'm offering anyway." "Well, you can take your offer," and she stopped mid-sentence, her attention caught by something behind him. Zander turned to see three men approaching, their expressions making it clear they weren't coming over to exchange pleasantries. The one in the lead was a weasel-faced man in an expensive suit that looked out of place in Fort Worth, flanked by two rougher types who had the look of hired guns. "Mrs. Parker," the man in the suit said, his voice oily with false courtesy. "I was hoping to run into you in town today. Saved me a trip out to that ranch of yours." "Mr. Sutton," Josephine said, and Zander heard the way her voice went flat and cold. "I have nothing to say to you." Now, let's be civil," Sutton said, moving closer. "I'm simply here to remind you that the banknote comes due in 2 weeks. That's September 1st, in case you've forgotten. I'd hate to see you lose that land, but business is business." "I'm aware of my obligations," Josephine said. "And I'll meet them." Sutton's smile didn't reach his eyes. "With what? That pitiful herd you've got left. We both know you can't possibly raise the $500 you owe. Why not save yourself the embarrassment and sell to me now? I'll give you $100 for the land and call the debt even. $100 for 200 acres of prime grazing land and a house." Josephine's voice shook, not with fear but with barely controlled fury. "That land is worth 10 times that, and you know it." "It's worth what someone is willing to pay, and right now, I'm the only buyer you've got," Sutton said. "But suit yourself. Come September 1st, the bank will foreclose and I'll buy the land at auction for even less. Either way, that ranch will be mine. I've got plans for a cattle operation that stretches from Fort Worth to the Red River, and your little piece of property is right in the middle of it." Zander had heard enough. He took a step forward, placing himself between Josephine and Sutton, his considerable presence suddenly filling the space. "The lady said she'd meet her obligations. Seems to me that means the conversation is over." Sutton looked up at Zander, clearly trying to decide if he was a threat worth worrying about. The two hired guns shifted their stance, hands moving closer to their pistols. "This is a private business matter, friend. I suggest you move along." "I suggest you take your own advice," Zander said quietly, but there was steel in his voice. "Before this conversation becomes less friendly." For a long moment, the tension stretched taut as a bowstring. Then Sutton smiled, though it looked more like a grimace. 2 weeks, Mrs. Parker. Not a day more." He tipped his hat mockingly and walked away, his men following. Josephine waited until they were out of earshot before she turned on Zander, her eyes blazing. "I don't need you or anyone else fighting my battles. I've been handling men like Sutton for 2 years, and I'll keep handling them." "Handling them right into losing your ranch from the sound of it," Zander observed. The words struck home. He could see it in the way her face paled, but she lifted her chin higher. "That's my business, not yours." "You're right," Zander agreed, "but I'm making it my business anyway." "Why?" The question burst from her, raw and frustrated. "You don't know me. You don't know anything about me or my situation. Why would you possibly care?" Zander was quiet for a moment, trying to find words for something he didn't fully understand himself. "Because 3 years ago, my brother got into a fight he couldn't win, and nobody stepped in to help him. I wasn't there. I've been asking myself since what might have been different if someone had. Maybe nothing, but maybe everything." He settled his hat back on his head. "So when I see someone fighting alone when they don't have to, I figure it's worth offering a hand." Josephine stared at him, and for the first time, some of the rigid defensiveness in her posture softened. "I'm sorry about your brother, but that doesn't change my situation. I don't have the money to pay you for help, even if I wanted to accept it." "Didn't ask for money," Zander said. "Got supplies for a few weeks, and I can work for food and a place to lay my bedroll." When she opened her mouth to protest, he held up a hand. I'm not leaving Fort Worth for a while anyway. Might as well be useful while I'm here. Why are you being so stubborn about this? A ghost of a smile crossed his weathered face. Could ask you the same question. Despite herself, despite everything, Josephine felt the corner of her mouth twitch. It wasn't quite a smile, but it was close, and something in Zander's chest tightened at the sight of it. Fine, she said finally. But just until my supplies are loaded. Then we part ways. Fair enough, Zander agreed, though he had no intention of keeping that promise. They worked in silence for the next 20 minutes, loading the rest of the supplies. Zander noticed how carefully Josephine counted out each item, how she checked the prices twice, how her face tightened when she had to put back a bag of coffee beans because she was a few cents short. When everything was secured, she climbed up onto the wagon seat with the kind of weariness that came from bones deep tired, not just from the day's work but from carrying too much for too long. "Thank you for your help, Mr. Frost," she said formally. "I do appreciate it, even if I didn't ask for it." Zander looked up at her, this stubborn, proud woman who was clearly drowning but refused to reach for a rope. "Where's your ranch?" "About 8 miles northeast, up by Clear Fork," she said. "Why?" "Because I'm riding out that way," he lied. "Might as well follow along, make sure you get home safe. I've been making this trip alone for 2 years. I think I can manage another 8 miles. Never said you couldn't." He moved to where his horse, a massive roan gelding that matched his owner in both size and temperament, was tied. "But the sun's getting high and this is open country. Would make me rest easier knowing you got home safe." Josephine wanted to argue. Every instinct she had, every defense she had built up over 2 years of fighting to survive alone, demanded that she send him away. But there was something in his steady gaze, something in the way he offered help without making it feel like charity or pity, that made her hesitate. And in that hesitation, she realized just how tired she was of fighting every battle alone. "Suit yourself," she said, gathering the reins. "But you're wasting your time." They set out from Fort Worth, the wagon creaking and groaning over the rutted road that led northeast toward the Clear Fork of the Trinity River. The August heat was brutal, the kind that made the air shimmer and turned every breath into work. Zander rode alongside the wagon, his eyes constantly scanning the horizon in the way of a man accustomed to danger. Josephine kept her attention on the road, but she was acutely aware of his presence, of the solid, steady way he sat his horse, of the easy confidence he carried like a second skin. "You said you came from the mountains," she said after a few miles, breaking the silence. She wasn't sure why she was making conversation, except that the quiet was starting to feel heavy with words unspoken. "Colorado," Zander confirmed. "Up in the high country west of Boulder. Been trapping up there for the past 3 years. That's a long way from Texas. What brings you to Fort Worth?" "Needed supplies. Figured it was time to see civilization again, even if just for a few days." He glanced at her. "You been ranching long?" "My husband and I bought the land 4 years ago," Josephine said, and her voice went carefully neutral. "We had plans, big plans, a cattle operation, maybe some horses. We were going to build something lasting." She was quiet for a moment. "Then Thomas died and all those plans died with him." "Sorry for your loss," Zander said, and the words weren't empty platitudes. She could hear genuine sympathy in his voice. "It was 2 years ago," Josephine said. "The stampede. A summer storm spooked the herd and he was in the wrong place when they ran, by the time the other ranchers got to him." She stopped, shook her head. "He always said this land would give us a future. Now I'm fighting just to keep it from burying me along with him. That Sutton fellow, he's been circling like a vulture, I'm guessing." "Since about a month after Thomas died," Josephine confirmed, her hands tightening on the reins. "He owns the bank in Fort Worth, along with half the businesses in town. He's been buying up land all over this part of Texas, building some kind of cattle empire. Our ranch sits right in the middle of a stretch he wants. He's been waiting for me to fail, and it looks like he's finally going to get his wish. You got any hands working the ranch? Josephine's laugh was bitter. Had two. They left last month when I couldn't pay them. Can't blame them, really. A failing ranch run by a woman who barely knows what she's doing isn't exactly a promising prospect. So you're running the whole operation yourself. What's left of it? She said. I've got maybe 40 head of cattle left, down from 200 when Thomas was alive. Lost most of them to disease, some to rustlers, more because I had to sell them to keep the bank from foreclosing sooner. I've got a small vegetable garden, some chickens. It's enough to keep me fed, but it's nowhere near enough to raise $500 in 2 weeks. Zander was quiet, processing this. He looked at her profile, at the determined set of her jaw, the way she held herself upright despite the weight pressing down on her shoulders. What happens if you lose the ranch? I have nowhere else to go, Josephine said simply. No family, no friends who could take me in. I suppose I could try to find work in Fort Worth, maybe as a seamstress or a cook, but... She trailed off, then straightened her shoulders. But that's not going to happen because I'm not losing the ranch. I'll figure something out, I always do. They rode in silence for a while longer, the landscape gradually changing from the dry scrubland closer to Fort Worth to slightly greener pastures as they neared the Clear Fork. Zander found himself studying the land with a practiced eye, noting the good grazing, the accessibility to water, the natural breaks and hollows where cattle could shelter from weather. It was good land, the kind worth fighting for. And the woman beside him was clearly willing to fight until she had nothing left to give. The ranch house came into view as they crested a small rise. It was a simple structure, wood frame with a covered porch, surrounded by a few outbuildings that had seen better days. A barn listed slightly to one side, its roof patched in places with mismatched boards. A chicken coop sat off to the left, and beyond it, Zander could see a small herd of cattle grazing in a fenced pasture that needed repairs. It was the kind of place that could be something with work and investment, but right now it looked like it was barely hanging on, much like its owner. Josephine pulled the wagon to a stop near the house and sat there for a moment, as if gathering strength for what came next. Then she climbed down, moving with the careful precision of someone whose body was protesting every movement. "Thank you for the escort, Mr. Frost. You can head back to town now before it gets too late." Zander dismounted and began untying the supplies from the wagon. "Sun won't set for a few more hours. Might as well help you unload these." "Mr. Frost, Zander," he interrupted. "And before you argue, consider that I'm bigger than you, already holding a 50-pound sack of flour and not inclined to listen to protests. Sometimes it's easier to just let folks help." Josephine opened her mouth, closed it, then shook her head with something that might have been exasperation or might have been reluctant amusement. "You're possibly the most stubborn man I've ever met." "Takes one to know one," Zander replied, carrying the flour toward the house. They unloaded the wagon together, falling into an easy rhythm despite the fact that they had met only hours before. Zander noted the neat interior of the house, the way everything had its place even though the furniture was worn and the curtains faded. It spoke of someone trying to maintain order in a situation that was rapidly spiraling out of control. When the last item was stored away, Josephine walked to the well and drew up a bucket of water, pouring it into a dipper and offering it to Zander first. He drank, nodded his thanks, then watched as she took her own drink, water spilling down her chin in her eagerness. When she lowered the dipper, he said, "I'm staying." "What? I'm staying," Zander repeated, For the next 2 weeks at least, going to help you get this ranch in order and figure out how to raise that money." "Absolutely not," Josephine said immediately. "I already told you I can't pay you. Already told you I'm not asking for pay, just food and a place to sleep." "Why would you do that? You don't even know me." Zander looked at her steadily. "Because you need help, whether you'll admit it or not. Because this is good land being wasted and that offends me. And because—" He paused, searching for the right words. "Because in 3 years of living alone in those mountains, I forgot what it was like to have a purpose beyond just surviving one more day. Maybe helping you is helping myself too." Josephine stared at him, and he saw a dozen emotions flicker across her face. Distrust, hope, fear, desperation, and something else he couldn't quite name. "I'm not a charity case," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "Never said you were. I'm offering a fair trade. My labor for room and board. If that offends your pride, then consider yourself lucky that I'm a man who enjoys hard work." He gentled his tone. "Let me help, Josephine. 2 weeks. If at the end of that time you want me gone, I'll leave and you'll never see me again." She closed her eyes, and he saw her shoulders slump slightly, saw the moment when her fierce independence finally acknowledged the reality of her situation. When she opened her eyes again, they were bright with unshed tears that she blinked away furiously. 2 weeks, she agreed. "But you follow my rules and you sleep in the barn." "Fair enough," Zander said, though his heart twisted at the sight of those tears she refused to let fall. That first evening, Josephine made a simple dinner of salt pork, beans, and cornbread while Zander saw to the animals and did a quick assessment of the property. When he came in for dinner, she had set 2 places at the small kitchen table, and they ate in awkward silence. She was clearly unused to having company, and he was unused to human interaction after years in the mountains. But there was something comfortable in the quiet, something that felt almost right about sitting across from her in the warm lamplight. After dinner, Zander helped with the dishes, then headed out to the barn to set up his bedroll. Josephine watched him go from the porch, her arms wrapped around herself against the cooling evening air. She couldn't shake the feeling that she had just made either the best or worst decision of her life, but she was too tired to figure out which. As she prepared for bed, she found herself listening for sounds from the barn, oddly comforted by the knowledge that someone else was on the property, that for the first time in 2 years, she wasn't facing the darkness alone. In the barn, Zander lay in the hay loft, staring up at the stars through a gap in the roof that needed patching. He thought about Josephine, about the stubborn pride that kept her fighting long past the point when most people would have given up. He thought about the way she moved, the way she held herself together through sheer force of will. And he thought about the brief moment when she had almost smiled at him in town, how that one small expression had affected him more than anything had in 3 long years. He had told her he needed a purpose, and that was true. But there was something else, something he hadn't admitted even to himself. In those few hours of knowing Josephine Parker, he had felt more alive, more connected, more present than he had since the day his brother died. And that feeling, dangerous and unexpected as it was, made him want to stay far longer than 2 weeks. The next morning arrived with the brutal heat of a Texas summer, and Zander was up before dawn, already assessing what needed to be done. The list was long and daunting. Fences needed repair, the barn roof needed patching, the cattle needed proper attention, and that was just the beginning. When Josephine emerged from the house, already dressed for work, she found him examining the fence line near the pasture. "These posts are rotted through," he said without preamble. "Half your cattle could break through if they had a mind to." "I know," Josephine said, carrying 2 cups of coffee. She handed him one, and he accepted it with a nod of thanks. "I've been meaning to fix them, but there's always something more urgent." "Nothing's more urgent than keeping your herd contained," Zander said. "That's money wandering off if this fence goes down. We'll start here today." "We?" Josephine raised an eyebrow. "I thought I was running this ranch." "You are," Zander agreed easily. "I'm just the hired hand who's pointing out what needs doing. You're welcome to disagree." She wanted to, he could see it in her eyes, but she was too practical to argue with logic. "Fine, but I work alongside you. I'm not going to stand around watching while you do all the labor." "Wouldn't expect anything else," Zander said, and they got to work. The day was long and grueling. They rode out to the far pastures to check the fence line, marking posts that needed replacing and stretches of wire that needed restringing. Zander worked with the easy efficiency of someone who had spent his life doing physical labor, his powerful muscles making quick work of tasks that would have taken Josephine hours. But he never made her feel useless or in the way. Instead, he explained what he was doing, asked her opinion on decisions, treated her like the equal partner in the work that she needed to be. By midday, they had replaced a dozen fence posts and restrung 200 feet of wire. They broke for lunch in the shade of a cottonwood tree near the creek, sharing the bread and cheese Josephine had brought. She watched him eat, noting the way he moved, economical and purposeful, nothing wasted. He caught her looking and raised an eyebrow. "Something on your mind?" "I'm trying to figure you out," Josephine admitted. "You show up out of nowhere, offer to help a stranger for no good reason, and you're actually good at what you do. It doesn't make sense." "Maybe it doesn't have to make sense," Zander said. "Maybe sometimes people help because it's the right thing to do. People don't work that way, not in my experience." "What's your experience?" Josephine was quiet for a long moment, staring out at the water. "When Thomas died, a lot of folks came by at first. Brought food, offered condolences, promised they'd be there if I needed anything. But when I actually did need help, when I needed hands to work the ranch or advice on managing the cattle or someone to stand with me when the bank came calling, suddenly, everyone was too busy with their own problems. I learned real quick that the only person I could count on was myself." "That's a lonely way to live," Zander observed. "Maybe," she agreed, "but it's better than counting on people who'll let you down." Zander understood that philosophy better than she knew. Wasn't that exactly why he had fled to the mountains after his brother's death? Because trusting in others, depending on anyone, had proven to be a risk he wasn't willing to take anymore. But looking at Josephine now, seeing the walls she had built around herself, he realized that isolation wasn't protection. It was just another kind of prison. "People will let you down," he said finally. "That's human nature. But closing yourself off completely, refusing to let anyone in, that's not living. That's just surviving, and there's a difference." "Says the man who spent 3 years alone in the mountains," Josephine shot back, but there was no real heat in her words. Zander acknowledged that with a slight smile. "Maybe I'm figuring that out too." They returned to work, and the afternoon passed in a haze of heat and effort. By the time the sun began to set, they had made significant progress on the fence line. Josephine's hands were raw with blisters despite her worn gloves, and Zander's shirt was soaked through with sweat. But there was a satisfaction in seeing the tangible results of their labor. That evening, Josephine made a better dinner than the night before, frying up some chicken from her coop and making biscuits that were light and flaky. They ate on the porch, watching the stars emerge in the darkening sky. The conversation came easier now, flowing from ranch work to stories about their pasts. Josephine told him about growing up in Missouri, about meeting Thomas at a church social, and being swept up in his dreams of building something in Texas. Zander told her about his childhood in the mountains of Colorado, about learning to hunt and trap from his father, about the brother who had been his best friend until one stupid fight ended everything. "You blame yourself?" Josephine asked quietly. "For not being there when your brother needed you?" "Every day," Zander admitted. "I know it's not rational. I was 2 towns over on business. There was no way I could have known what was happening. But logic doesn't change the feeling that I should have been there, that maybe if I had been, things would be different." "I understand that," Josephine said. "I replay the day Thomas died over and over in my mind. If I had gone with him to check the herd instead of staying back to tend the garden, maybe I could have done something. Maybe he'd still be alive and none of this would be happening. Or maybe you'd both be dead," Zander said gently. "Sometimes things happen that we can't control, no matter how much we wish we could. The hard part is learning to forgive ourselves for being human." Josephine looked at him, really looked at him, and saw past the intimidating size and the weathered exterior to the man underneath who carried his own burdens, his own guilt. "You're not what I expected," she said. "What did you expect?" "I don't know. Someone trying to take advantage, maybe. Or someone who'd give up when he realized how much work this place needs. But you're—" She searched for the right word. "You're solid, steady, like a mountain that doesn't move no matter how hard the wind blows." Something in Zander's chest warmed at her words. "I'll take that as a compliment." "It was meant as one," Josephine said, then stood abruptly, as if uncomfortable with the moment of vulnerability. "I should clean up and get to bed. Tomorrow's another early day." Over the following days they fell into a routine. Up before dawn, work until midday, break for lunch, work until sunset. They repaired the barn roof, fixed the broken stalls, tended the vegetable garden that had been struggling in the heat. Zander showed Josephine how to properly care for her cattle, how to check for signs of disease, how to manage the grazing rotation to make the most of her limited land. She was a quick learner, soaking up information like parched earth soaking up rain. But it wasn't just about the work. As the days passed, something else began to grow between them. It started small, barely noticeable. The way Zander's hand would linger when he helped her over a fence. The way Josephine found herself watching him work, admiring the play of muscles under his shirt, the confident way he moved. The conversations that stretched later into the evening, neither of them wanting to end the day. On the 5th day, disaster nearly struck. They were moving the cattle to a new pasture when one of the cows, a temperamental old girl with a mean streak, decided she'd had enough of being herded. She charged at Josephine, who was on foot, and for a heart-stopping moment, Zander saw the future play out in his mind. He spurred his horse forward without thinking, reaching Josephine in seconds and sweeping her up onto his saddle in front of him, the cow's horns missing her by inches. Josephine's heart was pounding, adrenaline flooding her system as she found herself pressed against Zander's broad chest, his arm wrapped protectively around her waist. She could feel the solid strength of him, the steady beat of his heart, the way his breath stirred her hair. For a moment, neither of them moved, frozen in that space between danger and safety. "You all right?" Zander's voice was rough, strained. "I'm fine," Josephine managed, though her voice shook. "Thank you." Zander loosened his grip, but he didn't let go immediately. His hand rested on her waist, his thumb absently stroking against the fabric of her dress in a gesture that felt both comforting and intimate. Josephine found she didn't want to move, didn't want to break the moment. She felt safe in a way she hadn't felt since Thomas died, protected in a way that didn't diminish her strength but instead complemented it. Finally, reluctantly, Zander lowered her to the ground. Their eyes met, and something unspoken passed between them, an acknowledgement of a shift in their relationship that neither was quite ready to name. Josephine stepped back, straightening her dress and trying to calm her racing heart, though she wasn't entirely sure if it was racing from the near miss with the cow or from being held in Zander's arms. That evening, the tension between them was palpable. They moved around each other carefully, hyper-aware of every accidental touch, every shared glance. When dinner was over and Zander stood to head to the barn, Josephine found herself speaking before she could think better of it. "Zander, wait," he turned, his pale eyes questioning. "I just wanted to say thank you, again, for today, for everything you've been doing here." She paused, struggling with words. "I know I haven't been the most gracious about accepting help, but I want you to know that I appreciate it, more than I can say." Zander took a step closer, and in the lamplight his face was all shadows and angles. "Josephine, there's something you should know." "What?" "I'm not staying out of obligation or pity or because I've got nothing better to do." His voice was low, intense. "I'm staying because being here, working with you, it makes me feel something I thought I'd lost. And every day that passes, I find it harder to imagine leaving." Josephine's breath caught in her throat. She knew she should say something, should establish boundaries, should protect the careful walls she had built around her heart. But standing there in the warm Texas night, looking up at this man who had appeared in her life like some kind of answer to a prayer she hadn't known she was praying, she couldn't find the words to push him away. "Zander, you don't have to say anything," he interrupted gently. "I'm not asking for anything from you. I just wanted you to know." He left then, heading out to the barn, and Josephine stood on the porch for a long time, her hand pressed to her chest where her heart was beating too fast. She was in dangerous territory, she knew that. She had sworn after Thomas died that she would never depend on anyone again, never let herself be vulnerable to the kind of pain that came from losing someone you loved. But Zander was breaking through those defenses without even trying, and she wasn't sure if she was strong enough to stop him. Wasn't sure if she even wanted to. The next few days were a study in controlled tension. They worked together as efficiently as ever, but there was an awareness between them that hadn't been there before. Zander was careful not to push, not to demand anything she wasn't ready to give, but his presence was constant, steady, reassuring. And Josephine found herself leaning on that presence more than she wanted to admit. On the 8th day, they rode into Fort Worth together to sell some of the produce from her garden and buy a few supplies they needed for the ranch. It was market day, and the town was bustling with activity. They set up at a small spot near the general store, and Josephine was pleasantly surprised by how quickly her vegetables sold. Zander stood nearby, his imposing presence keeping away any troublemakers, though he let her handle all the transactions herself. They were packing up to leave when Sutton appeared, flanked as always by his hired guns. "Mrs. Parker," he said, his smile not reaching his eyes, "I see you found yourself some help, though I'm not sure a drifter is going to solve your financial problems." "My affairs are none of your concern, Mr. Sutton," Josephine said coolly. "Oh, but they are, considering you owe my bank a significant sum of money. Just a friendly reminder that you have 1 week left. That's September 1st, bright and early." Zander moved to stand next to Josephine, and Sutton's eyes flickered with something that might have been nervousness. "The lady's aware of her obligations. You've delivered your reminder. Now move along." My, you found yourself a protector," Sutton said, but he took a step back. "How touching. But protection doesn't pay debts, Mrs. Parker. I'll see you in a week." He tipped his hat mockingly and walked away. Josephine's hands were shaking as she climbed onto the wagon. Zander swung up beside her this time instead of riding his horse, and without a word, he took the reins from her trembling hands. They rode in silence until they were out of town, and then Josephine finally spoke. 1 week. I have 1 week to come up with $500, and I have no idea how to do it. Her voice cracked on the last word, and she pressed her hand to her mouth, trying to hold back the tears that threatened to fall. Zander pulled the wagon to a stop and turned to face her. Look at me, Josephine. She did, and the concern in his eyes nearly undid her. We're going to figure this out, he said firmly. We've got 7 days, and we're going to use every one of them. Tomorrow, we're taking your cattle to Fort Worth and selling them. It won't be enough on its own, but it's a start. Those cattle are all I have left, Josephine protested. If I sell them, even if I save the ranch, I'll have no way to make it profitable again. One problem at a time, Zander said. First, we save the ranch, then we figure out the rest. He reached out and took her hand, his large, calloused palm enveloping her smaller one. Trust me, Josephine, please. And looking into his steady, determined eyes, Josephine found that she did trust him. Against all her better judgment, against every defense she had erected, she trusted this man who had walked into her life barely more than a week ago. All right, she whispered. All right. The next morning they began rounding up the cattle. It was hard, hot work, made more difficult by the fact that there were only 2 of them to do a job that should have required at least 4 hands. But Zander worked with the skill of someone who had been around cattle his whole life, and Josephine proved herself to be far more capable than she had been when he first arrived. By early afternoon, they had the entire small herd gathered and started the long drive back to Fort Worth. They reached the stockyards as the sun was beginning to set, and Zander negotiated with the cattle buyer while Josephine watched. He was firm but fair, refusing to be lowballed, and in the end, he got a decent price for the cattle. When the money was counted out, they had $285. It was more than Josephine had dared to hope for, but it was still far short of what she needed. That night, back at the ranch, they sat at the kitchen table and counted the money along with the small savings Josephine had managed to scrape together. $320 total. They were still $180 short, with 6 days to go. I could sell my wedding ring, Josephine said quietly, looking down at the simple gold band on her finger. It's not worth much, but maybe $50. No, Zander said immediately. That's not an option. Why not? It's just a thing. It won't bring Thomas back. It's not just a thing, Zander said gently. It's a symbol of the life you had, the love you shared. You don't sacrifice that. Josephine looked at him, her eyes bright with unshed tears. Then what do? We're running out of time and options. Zander was quiet for a long moment, his mind working through possibilities. Finally, he said, I have money. What? 3 years of trapping in the mountains. I didn't have anything to spend it on up there. I've got close to $400 saved, stashed away safe. I can absolutely not, Josephine interrupted, her voice sharp. I'm not taking your money, Zander. That's your future, your security. It's just sitting there doing nothing, Zander argued. Let me help you. No, Josephine said firmly. I won't accept that. You've already done so much, given so much of your time and labor. I can't ask you to give your savings too. You're not asking, I'm offering. And I'm refusing. Josephine stood, pacing the small kitchen. There has to be another way. I'll sell the furniture, the chickens, whatever we can spare. I'll find a way that doesn't involve taking your money. They argued back and forth for another hour, neither willing to give ground. Finally, exhausted and frustrated, they called a truce and went to their separate sleeping quarters. But neither of them slept much that night. The next morning, Zander had an idea. The horses, he said over breakfast. We could catch and break some of the wild horses that run in the hills north of here. Good horses sell for decent money, and if we can break 3 or 4 of them in the next few days, that could give us the money we need." Josephine looked skeptical. "That's dangerous work, and we don't have much time." Got a better idea? She didn't, so they set out that afternoon with rope and determination. The wild horse herds in North Texas were legendary, descendants of Spanish Mustangs that had gone feral. They were tough, smart, and difficult to catch, let alone break. But Zander had experience with this kind of work from his years in Colorado, and Josephine was willing to try anything. It took them 2 days to catch 3 horses, young stallions that showed promise. Then began the painstaking work of breaking them to saddle. Zander took the lead on this, his patient, firm approach slowly earning the trust of the frightened animals. Josephine watched in amazement as this massive, powerful man worked with a gentleness she wouldn't have believed possible, talking to the horses in a low, soothing voice, never forcing, always encouraging. On the 4th day, he was thrown. One of the stallions, a spirited bay with a wild eye, bucked hard and sent Zander flying into the fence rail. Josephine's heart stopped as she watched him hit the ground and lie still. She ran to him, dropping to her knees beside him, her hands shaking as she checked for broken bones or worse. "Zander, please," she whispered, her voice breaking. "Please be all right." His eyes opened and he groaned. "Still breathing," he managed. "Just knocked the wind out of me." "Don't you dare do that again," Josephine said fiercely, and then, before she could stop herself, she was crying. All the fear, all the stress, all the emotions she had been holding in for days came pouring out. "You could have been killed. You could have broken your neck, and it would have been my fault because this is all for me, for my ranch, for my problems." Zander sat up slowly, then pulled her into his arms. She went willingly, burying her face against his chest as the tears came. He held her, one hand stroking her hair, murmuring soft reassurances. "I'm fine, Josephine. I'm right here. I'm not going anywhere." When the tears finally subsided, Josephine pulled back slightly, embarrassed by her outburst. "I'm sorry. I don't usually fall apart like that." "You're entitled to fall apart," Zander said. "You've been holding everything together for so long. Sometimes you need to let someone else be strong for a while." Josephine looked up at him, at his weathered face and kind eyes, and something inside her finally broke open. "I'm scared," she admitted. "I'm so scared of losing everything, of failing, of ending up with nothing. And I'm scared of this, of what I'm feeling for you, because I can't afford to need anyone. Needing people only leads to pain." "Josephine, no, let me finish," she said. "You came into my life at the worst possible time, and yet somehow it feels like the exactly right time. You've given me hope when I had none. You've made me feel like maybe I don't have to do everything alone. And that terrifies me, Zander, because what happens when you leave? What happens when this is over and you go back to your mountains and I'm alone again?" Zander cupped her face in his hands, his thumb brushing away the tears that still clung to her lashes. "What if I don't want to go back to the mountains?" he said quietly. "What if I want to stay here with you? You can't mean that. You barely know me." "I know enough," Zander said. "I know you're the strongest, most stubborn, most determined woman I've ever met. I know you fight for what's yours with everything you have. I know you make the best biscuits I've ever tasted, and you sing to yourself when you think no one's listening, and you care for those chickens like they're your children." He paused, his eyes intense on hers. "And I know that somewhere in the past 2 weeks, I've fallen in love with you, Josephine Parker. Maybe it doesn't make sense, maybe it's too fast, but it's the truth." Josephine's breath caught. She wanted to protest, to argue, to list all the reasons why this was impossible. But looking into his eyes, Seeing the sincerity there, feeling the solid strength of him, she couldn't deny what was in her own heart. "I love you too," she whispered, and saying the words out loud felt like jumping off a cliff. "God help me, I love you too." Zander smiled then, a real smile that transformed his face, and he kissed her. It was gentle at first, tentative, a question and an answer all at once. Then Josephine's arms came up around his neck, pulling him closer, and the kiss deepened, becoming something more urgent, more real. When they finally pulled apart, both were breathing hard, and the world seemed to have shifted on its axis. "We should get back to work," Josephine said eventually, though she made no move to leave his arms. "We should," Zander agreed, but he kissed her again first, quick and sweet. They did get back to work, but something fundamental had changed between them. The awareness that had been building for days had crystallized into something clear and undeniable. They loved each other. Against all odds, against all logic, they had found each other in the midst of crisis and chaos, and that love gave them strength they hadn't had before. Over the next 2 days, they worked like people possessed. They finished breaking the 3 horses, and Zander's assessment proved correct. They were good animals that would sell well. They also sold every piece of furniture Josephine could spare, every tool that wasn't absolutely essential, everything they could think of that had any value. By the evening before the deadline, they had $490. They were still $10 short. Josephine sat at the now bare kitchen table, staring at the money spread before them. So close. They had come so close, and yet it wasn't enough. Tomorrow morning she would lose everything. "I'm selling my wedding ring," she said flatly. "It's the only thing left." "Josephine, no arguments, Zander. It's my decision." She twisted the ring off her finger and held it in her palm, staring at it. "Thomas would understand. He'd want me to save the ranch, not hold on to sentiment." Zander looked at her, saw the determination in her face, the way she was steeling herself to make this sacrifice. And in that moment, he made a decision of his own. "Wait here," he said, and strode out to the barn. He returned a few minutes later with a small leather pouch. He opened it and poured the contents onto the table. Gold coins glinted in the lamplight. "Zander, no," Josephine said immediately. "We already discussed this. I can't take your money." "You're not taking it," Zander said firmly. "I'm investing it, in this ranch, in our future. Because if you think I'm going to let you go through with selling that ring, you don't know me as well as I thought." He picked up the gold band and placed it back on her finger. "This stays where it belongs." "But no buts," Zander interrupted. "Josephine, I love you. That means your problems are my problems, your fights are my fights. You've been fighting alone for 2 years, but you're not alone anymore. Let me do this. Let me be your partner, not just in work, but in everything." Josephine looked from the money to his face, and what she saw there made her heart swell. Love, determination, commitment, everything she thought she had lost was being offered to her again, in a different form but no less real. "You're sure?" she whispered. "Never been more sure of anything in my life." She kissed him then, pouring everything she couldn't say into that kiss. When they pulled apart, she was crying again, but this time they were tears of relief, of hope, of joy. "Thank you," she said. "Thank you for not giving up on me. For making me believe in possibilities again." "That's what love does," Zander said simply. "It makes the impossible possible." The next morning they rode into Fort Worth together, the money safely secured. The bank opened at 9 o'clock and they were there waiting. Sutton arrived a few minutes later, his expression smug and confident. He clearly expected Josephine to come in defeated, ready to sign over her property. His face when she walked up to the counter and counted out $500 in exact change was worth every ounce of effort it had taken to get that money. "I believe this settles my debt," Josephine said, her voice calm and clear. The bank clerk counted the money twice, then nodded. "Debt paid in full, Mrs. Parker. I'll prepare the paperwork showing the note is satisfied." Sutton's face had gone red. "This isn't over," he said quietly, so only Josephine and Zander could hear. "I'll find another way to get that land." Zander took a step forward, and even though he didn't say a word, something in his expression made Sutton take a step back. "The lady paid her debt fair and square. You'd be wise to accept that and move on. Because if you come around bothering her again, you'll have to deal with me. And I promise you won't enjoy that experience." For a moment, Sutton looked like he might argue. Then he glanced at Zander's massive frame, at the cold determination in his eyes, and thought better of it. He turned and stalked out of the bank without another word. Josephine let out a breath she didn't know she'd been holding. "It's really over," she said wonderingly. "The ranch is saved." "The ranch is saved," Zander confirmed, and the smile he gave her was full of warmth and promise. They collected the paperwork, then walked out of the bank into the bright September morning. Josephine felt like she could breathe for the first time in 2 years, like a weight had been lifted from her shoulders. She turned to Zander, and the words came without thinking. "Marry me." He blinked, clearly surprised. "What? Marry me?" Josephine repeated. "You said you wanted to be my partner in everything. You gave me back hope, gave me back my future. I want to share that future with you officially, legally, permanently. So I'm asking, Zander Frost, will you marry me?" A slow smile spread across Zander's face. "Josephine Parker, nothing would make me happier." He swept her up in his arms, spinning her around right there in the middle of the street, and kissed her as the citizens of Fort Worth looked on with varying degrees of shock and amusement. They were married 3 days later in a simple ceremony at the church in Fort Worth, with the preacher and his wife as witnesses. Josephine wore her best dress, which wasn't saying much, but Zander looked at her like she was the most beautiful thing he had ever seen. They spoke their vows with hands clasped and hearts full, promising to love and support each other through whatever challenges lay ahead. The months that followed were the happiest of Josephine's life. She and Zander worked together to rebuild the ranch, and what had been a constant struggle became something joyful when shared. Zander proved to be everything she could have hoped for in a partner, strong when she needed strength, gentle when she needed comfort, always steady, always there. He taught her more about ranching than she had learned in all her years with Thomas, and he did it with patience and respect for her intelligence and capability. They bought new cattle with the little money they had left, started small but smart. Zander's knowledge of the land and animals combined with Josephine's determination and organizational skills made them an effective team. By the spring of 1876, the ranch was not just surviving but actually showing a profit for the first time in years. But it wasn't just the work that made life good. It was the small moments. The way Zander would pull her into his arms at the end of a long day just to hold her. The way he laughed at her terrible jokes and told her stories of his mountain adventures. The way he looked at her over breakfast, like she was the answer to every question he'd ever asked. And the way he made her feel safe, cherished, loved in a way that was different from what she had known before, deeper, more equal, more real. In May of 1876, Josephine realized she was pregnant. She told Zander one evening after dinner, nervous about how he would react. They hadn't discussed children, hadn't planned for this, and she worried that he might feel trapped or overwhelmed. Instead, his face lit up like the sunrise. "A baby," he said, his voice full of wonder. "We're having a baby, we are," Josephine confirmed, and found herself laughing as he picked her up and spun her around, whooping with joy. "Careful," she said, though she was laughing too. "You'll make me dizzy." "I'm going to be a father," Zander said, setting her down but keeping his arms around her. "We're going to be parents. Josephine, this is. He seemed at a loss for words, so he kissed her instead, pouring all his happiness and love into that kiss. The pregnancy progressed smoothly, and Zander became even more protective than usual. He took over the heavier work on the ranch, insisted Josephine rest more, worried over her constantly. It was sometimes exasperating, but mostly it was endearing. This big, strong mountain man reduced to fretting over his wife like a mother hen. Their son was born in January of 1877, in the middle of a cold snap that had Zander nearly wearing a path in the floor with his pacing. The midwife finally took pity on him and led him into the room, and he was there to see his child take his first breath. They named him Thomas Zachary Frost, honoring both the past and the future. Holding his son for the first time, Zander felt his heart expand in a way he hadn't thought possible. This tiny, perfect human was his, theirs, a symbol of everything good that had come from two broken people finding each other and choosing to build something new together. Life on the ranch took on a new rhythm with a baby in the house. Josephine proved to be a natural mother, patient and loving, and Zander was constantly amazed by her strength. She managed to care for their son, keep the household running, and still contribute to the ranch work, though he tried to take as much of that burden as he could. As Thomas grew, the ranch continued to prosper. Word spread about the quality of their cattle and horses, and they began to build a reputation in North Texas. Other ranchers came to them for advice, and Zander and Josephine found themselves becoming pillars of the community in a way neither had expected. Sutton had left Fort Worth not long after they paid off the debt, his reputation damaged by his obvious attempts to steal Josephine's land. A new banker had taken over, a fair man who was willing to work with ranchers rather than against them. The town itself was growing, becoming less wild and more settled, though it still retained that frontier spirit that had drawn so many to Texas in the first place. In the fall of 1878, Josephine found herself pregnant again. This time they were prepared, excited, ready to welcome another child into their growing family. Their daughter was born in May of 1879, a tiny, fierce little thing with her mother's green eyes and her father's determination. They named her Sarah Rose, and she completed their family in a way that felt perfect. Watching Zander with their children, Josephine often thought about how much her life had changed. 3 years ago, she had been alone, desperate, facing the loss of everything she had worked for. Now she had a thriving ranch, 2 beautiful children, and a husband who loved her with a steadiness that never wavered. Sometimes, she still had to pinch herself to believe it was real. One evening in the summer of 1880, after the children were asleep, Josephine and Zander sat on the porch watching the sunset. It had become their ritual, this quiet time together at the end of the day. Zander had his arm around her and she leaned into his solid strength, feeling content in a way she had never imagined possible. "You ever miss it?" she asked. "The mountains, the solitary life you had before?" Zander considered the question seriously. "Sometimes I miss the quiet," he admitted. "But I wouldn't trade this for anything. That life was about hiding, about running from pain. This life is about building something, about being part of something bigger than myself." He kissed the top of her head. "You gave me that, Josephine. You gave me a reason to come back to the world." "You gave me a reason to keep fighting," Josephine said. "I was so close to giving up when you showed up that day in Fort Worth. Another week and I would have lost everything." "But you didn't give up," Zander pointed out. "You never would have. That's not who you are, maybe not. But having you beside me made all the difference." She tilted her head to look up at him. "Do you remember what you said to me that first day? That you weren't leaving Fort Worth for a while, so you might as well be useful?" Zander smiled. "I was lying through my teeth." I had planned to restock my supplies and head back to the mountains within a week. Then I saw you, so stubborn and proud and determined, and I couldn't walk away. What made you stay? Really? You did, Zander said simply. I told myself I was staying to help you save the ranch, but that wasn't the whole truth. I stayed because when I looked at you, I saw someone worth staying for. Someone worth building a life with. He paused, his hand coming up to cup her face. I stayed because I wanted to see you smile. And once I saw that smile, I knew I'd do anything to see it again and again for the rest of my life. Tears pricked Josephine's eyes, the good kind that came from overwhelming happiness. I love you, she said. I will love you until the day I die and beyond. And I love you, Zander replied. My stubborn, independent, beautiful wife who never asked for help, but let me give it anyway. They sat there as the stars came out, wrapped in each other's arms, two people who had been broken and alone finding wholeness in each other. The ranch stretched out around them, the land they had fought for and saved together, the foundation of the life they had built. Inside the house, their children slept peacefully, secure in the knowledge that they were loved and protected. The cattle grazed in the pastures, the horses dozed in the barn, and the whole world seemed to be holding its breath in the perfect peace of the moment. Years would pass, and there would be challenges ahead. Droughts and storms, difficult seasons and unexpected setbacks. But Josephine and Zander would face them together, their love growing deeper and stronger with each passing year. They would watch their children grow, would eventually welcome grandchildren, would become the kind of love story people told their own children about the stubborn widow and the mountain man who helped her save her ranch, and ended up saving each other in the process. But on that evening in 1880, sitting on the porch of the ranch house they had fought so hard to keep, all of that was still ahead of them. For now, there was just the two of them, the land they loved and the family they had created. It was everything Josephine had thought she lost when Thomas died, given back to her in a different form, better and stronger and more real than anything she had imagined. As the last light faded from the sky and the first chill of evening set in, they stood and went inside together, hand in hand. Tomorrow would bring work and responsibility and all the demands of ranch life. But tonight, there was just love, pure and simple and enduring. And for two people who had both learned the hard way that tomorrow was never guaranteed, tonight was more than enough. The years rolled on with the steady rhythm of seasons changing and children growing. By 1885, young Thomas was 8 years old and already showing signs of his father's quiet strength and his mother's sharp mind. He followed Zander everywhere, learning the ways of ranching with an eagerness that made both parents proud. Sarah, at 6, was a whirlwind of energy and curiosity, driving her mother to distraction and delight in equal measure. The ranch had expanded significantly. They now ran nearly 300 head of cattle and had become known throughout North Texas for their well-trained horses. Zander had hired 2 steady hands to help with the work, good men who respected Josephine as much as they respected her husband. The house had been expanded too, with an additional bedroom and a proper dining room where they could entertain the neighbors who had become friends. Josephine often marveled at how different her life was from those dark days before Zander arrived. She had friends now, real friends who valued her for more than just her connection to a dead husband. She had a voice in the community, and people listened when she spoke at town meetings about issues affecting ranchers. She had become the woman she was always meant to be, and it was Zander's unwavering support and belief in her that had made it possible. One spring morning in 1886, Zander and Josephine were working together to repair a section of fence when a rider approached. It was unusual enough to get visitors this far from town that they both stopped to watch. As the rider got closer, Zander felt a jolt of recognition followed by disbelief. "It can't be," he said, his voice barely a whisper. The rider dismounted, and Josephine saw a man in his 30s with features that bore a striking resemblance to her husband. "Zander," the man said tentatively. "Zander Frost, Jacob." Zander's voice was rough with emotion. "Is that really you?" "It's me, brother," Jacob said. And then they were embracing. Two brothers who hadn't seen each other in years, both of them with tears streaming down their faces. Josephine watched the reunion with her own eyes wet, understanding instinctively what this meant. This was the brother Zander thought he had lost, the reason he had fled to the mountains. She waited until they had pulled apart before stepping forward. "Josephine," Zander said, his voice thick with emotion. "This is my brother Jacob. Jacob, this is my wife Josephine." "Wife?" Jacob looked between them in amazement. "Last I heard, you had disappeared into the Colorado mountains swearing off civilization forever. Now you're married and—" He looked around at the ranch. "Living in Texas. It's a long story," Zander said. "A very long story. Come up to the house. We have a lot to catch up on." Over coffee at the kitchen table, the story came out. Jacob hadn't died in that bar fight years ago. He had been badly injured, spent weeks unconscious in a doctor's care. By the time he recovered enough to send word to Zander, his brother was long gone, disappeared into the mountains. Jacob had spent the last 3 years searching for him, following rumors and half-heard stories, until finally a trapper in Colorado had mentioned a man matching Zander's description who had headed south toward Texas. "I never gave up hope of finding you," Jacob said. "Even when everyone told me you were probably dead, I couldn't accept it. You're my brother. I had to know for sure." Zander's hand found Josephine's under the table, squeezing tight. "I'm sorry," he said to Jacob. "I'm so sorry I didn't stay, didn't keep looking for you. When they told me you were dead, I couldn't face it. I ran." "I understand," Jacob said. "Truly, I do, and it looks like that running led you somewhere good." He smiled at Josephine. "My brother always did have good instincts, even if he took the long way around." They talked for hours, catching up on lost years, sharing stories of the lives they had lived apart. Jacob told them about settling in Colorado, about the small ranch he had built there, about the woman he had married and lost to illness 2 years prior. Zander told him about coming to Fort Worth, about meeting Josephine, about the life they had built together. "Stay," Josephine said suddenly, interrupting the flow of conversation. Both men looked at her in surprise. "Stay here with us, Jacob. We have room, we have work, and your family. You should be here." "I couldn't impose like that," Jacob protested, but she could see the hope in his eyes. "It's not imposing," Zander said firmly. "It's where you belong. I lost you once, brother. I'm not losing you again." And so Jacob stayed. He moved into the expanded house, took on a role managing the horse operation, and slowly became an integral part of the ranch and the family. Young Thomas and Sarah adored their uncle, and Jacob seemed to heal some of the grief he carried for his own lost family by becoming part of theirs. The summer of 1887 brought a drought, the worst North Texas had seen in a decade. Water became scarce, pastures turned brown, and cattle started dying. Many ranchers in the area lost everything. But Zander's experience in the mountains, his knowledge of finding and conserving water, combined with Josephine's careful management of their resources, allowed them to weather the crisis. They lost some cattle, but the core of their herd survived, and they were able to help their neighbors through the worst of it. That experience cemented their reputation in the community. The Frosts were known as people you could count on, people who helped their neighbors, who gave back to the community that had supported them. It was exactly the kind of legacy Josephine had dreamed of building with Thomas all those years ago, now made real with Zander. In 1889, Josephine was surprised to find herself pregnant again. At 34, she had thought her childbearing years were behind her, but apparently fate had other plans. Zander was thrilled, fussing over her even more than he had with the first two pregnancies. Jacob teased him mercilessly about it, but there was affection in the teasing. Their second daughter was born in early 1890, a healthy girl with her father's pale blue eyes. They named her Elizabeth Grace, and she completed their family in a way that felt perfect. Thomas was now 13 and taking on more responsibility on the ranch. Sarah was 11, helping her mother with the household and showing a surprising talent for managing the ranch's finances. As Josephine held her new daughter, with Zander sitting beside her on the bed and their older children crowded around to meet their new sister, she thought about the journey that had brought her here. All the pain, all the struggle, all the moments when she thought she couldn't go on, they had all been leading to this moment, to this family, to this life. "What are you thinking?" Zander asked softly, reading the expression on her face. "I'm thinking about that day in Fort Worth," Josephine said. "The day you decided to help the stubborn widow who never asked for anything from anyone." "Best decision I ever made," Zander said, kissing her forehead. "Mine too," Josephine agreed. "Mine too." The 1890s brought more changes. Thomas grew into a fine young man, eventually meeting and marrying a rancher's daughter from a neighboring property. They built their own house on a piece of the Frost land, staying close but establishing their own independence. Sarah, true to her fiery nature, decided she wanted to become a teacher and went away to school in Austin, though she came home for summers and holidays. Jacob met a widow in Fort Worth in 1893 and after a proper courtship, married her. She was a kind woman with 2 children of her own, and they made a home in town while Jacob continued to work on the ranch. It seemed that the Frost brothers were both destined to find love after loss, to build new families from the ashes of old grief. By 1895, 20 years after that fateful day when Zander first saw Josephine loading her wagon in Fort Worth, the ranch had become one of the most successful operations in North Texas. They ran 500 head of cattle, bred and sold horses that were in demand across the state, and employed 6 steady hands year-round. The original house had been rebuilt entirely, a sprawling ranch house with a wide porch that wrapped around 3 sides. But for all the success, for all the growth and prosperity, what mattered most to Zander and Josephine was each other. Their love had deepened over the years, aged like fine whiskey into something smooth and warming. They still sat on the porch most evenings, still found time to be alone together despite the demands of the ranch and family. They had learned each other's rhythms, each other's needs, had become so in tune that sometimes they didn't need words to communicate. One evening in the late summer of 1895, as they sat watching the sunset, Josephine said, "Do you ever regret it? Giving up the mountains, the solitary life, all of it for this?" It was a question she had asked before over the years, and Zander's answer was always the same. "Never," he said firmly. "Not for a single moment. That life was existing. This is living. Even when the work is hard and the money is tight and the children are driving us crazy, especially then," Zander said with a smile. "Because hard work shared is lighter, tight money managed together is enough, and children driving us crazy means we've got children to love. None of that I had before you." Josephine leaned her head on his shoulder, fitting perfectly against his side as she always had. "I never asked for help that day. Did you know that? I was so determined to do everything myself, so convinced that accepting help was the same as admitting defeat. I know, Zander said. That's what made helping you so satisfying. You didn't want it, but you needed it. And stubborn as you were smart enough to accept it eventually. You didn't give me much choice, Josephine pointed out with amusement. You just kept showing up, kept doing things, kept being there whether I wanted you to or not. That's what love is, Zander said. It's showing up, especially when the other person is too proud or too scared to ask. It's being there, even when you're not wanted because you know you're needed. And it's staying until that person smiles because their happiness becomes more important than anything else. I smiled a lot before you left, Josephine said softly. Do you remember that first evening when you insisted on staying to help unload the wagon and I finally gave in? I smiled then, just a little. You could have left right after, kept your promise to yourself, but you stayed anyway. Because one smile wasn't enough, Zander said. I wanted to see you smile every day for the rest of my life. And here we are, 20 years later, and that's still what I want. You've given me more than smiles, Josephine said. You've given me back my life, my hope, my future. You've given me children and a home and a love I didn't think I'd ever find again. You've given me everything. We gave each other everything, Zander corrected. You gave me a reason to come back from the edge, to rejoin the world, to believe in something beyond just surviving. We saved each other, Josephine. That's what makes this work. They sat in comfortable silence as the stars began to appear, the same stars they had watched together for 20 years, the same sky that had witnessed every moment of their journey from strangers to partners to lovers to a family. The ranch around them was quiet, peaceful, the work of the day done and the rest of the world far away. Inside the house, young Elizabeth was practicing her piano lessons, the slightly off-key notes floating out through the open windows. Somewhere in the distance, cattle lowed softly and a horse whinnied in the barn. It was the sound of home, of life, of everything they had built together. I love you, Josephine said, the words as fresh and true as the day she first spoke them. I love you too, Zander replied, his arm tightening around her. Today, tomorrow, and every day after. That's my promise, Josephine, until the end of time. And sitting there on the porch of the ranch, they had saved together, surrounded by the life they had built from nothing but determination and love. That promise felt as solid and enduring as the Texas land beneath their feet. The years continued to pass, bringing the joys and challenges that come with a life fully lived. They saw Thomas become a father himself, making them grandparents to 3 beautiful grandchildren. They watched Sarah become an accomplished teacher, shaping young minds in Fort Worth, and eventually becoming the principal of the town's schoolhouse. Elizabeth grew up strong and independent like her mother, eventually studying veterinary medicine, a rare choice for a woman but one her parents supported wholeheartedly through it all, through every triumph and setback, every joy and sorrow. Zander and Josephine faced it together. They had learned that lesson well in those early days, that life was easier, better, more meaningful when shared with someone who loved you unconditionally. As they grew older, their bodies not quite as strong as they once were, they often reflected on that day in Fort Worth when their paths first crossed. It had seemed like such a small moment at the time, a mountain man offering help to a stubborn widow. But from that small moment had grown an entire lifetime, a legacy of love and family and perseverance that would continue long after they were gone. We did good, didn't we? Josephine said one evening in 1910, when they were both well into their 50s, sitting in their familiar spots on the porch. We did better than good, Zander replied, his hand finding hers with the easy familiarity of decades. We did extraordinary. And looking out at the ranch that had once been a failing dream and was now a thriving legacy, at the family that had grown from just the two of them into something beautiful and enduring, Josephine had to agree. They had taken brokenness and built wholeness. They had taken despair and created hope. They had taken two lonely people and created a love story for the ages. The woman who never asked for help had learned that accepting help wasn't weakness, it was wisdom. The mountain man who had been running from pain had learned that facing it, embracing it, working through it with someone you loved was the path to healing. Together, they had learned that love wasn't just about the grand gestures or the passionate moments. It was about showing up every day, doing the work, staying through the hard times and choosing each other over and over again. And in the end, that was the greatest legacy of all, not the successful ranch or the children who carried on their values, but the simple, profound truth that two people could find each other in the chaos of life and build something lasting, something real, something worth every sacrifice and every struggle. The sun set on another day, painting the Texas sky in shades of gold and crimson. Zander and Josephine sat together, their hands clasped, their hearts full, their life complete. And as the stars began to emerge one by one, like promises being kept, they knew without doubt that they had found what so many people spend their whole lives searching for: a love that endured, a partnership that sustained, and a happiness that came not from avoiding the storms of life, but from weathering them together. It was everything they never knew they needed, given to them on a hot August day in 1875 when a stubborn woman refused help and a determined man gave it anyway. From that moment of connection, from that first small kindness, had grown a lifetime of love, and it was perfect.